If you've ever shot in SLOG3 and ended up with blown out skies, noisy shadows, or just footage that doesn't look the way it should, you're not alone. I recently made a full guide about how to nail your SLOG3 footage, and it helped a ton of people, but y'all still had some questions in the comments. So I took all of them, dropped them into ChatGPT, and asked, what are people still confused about? And what came back were 5 things. Do LUTs change zebra values? How do you get exposure for landscape when there isn't a skin tone in the scene? What ISO values are best for low noise results? How to expose multiple skin tones in the same shot? And how to get exposure when the lighting is changing. And those 5 things are what we're gonna solve in this video. But before we get into the first one, let's do a really quick crash course on how to use zebras and what they are, because everything else is gonna be built off of that. Zebras are those moving stripes you see on your screen. They tell you when something in your frame is hitting a certain brightness level, measured numerically, usually between 50 and 100. You can turn them on in your camera menu, and don't worry, they don't show up in your final footage. Go into the zebra display settings, we're gonna choose custom 1, and then set the lower limit to the exact value you want to expose for. Now, this exposure chart tells you what value different things in your scene should be exposed to. For example, on this SLOG3 adjusted version, my skin tone should be set to 66. So I set my zebra value to 66 in camera, and then I just increase the exposure until the zebras just barely start to show up on the brightest part of my face, and that's it. And you can do that by adding light, lowering your f-stop, or if you have to, bump the in-camera ISO up. The core idea is this. Pick the subject that you care about, look up that subject's value on the chart, then you're gonna make sure you have zebras turned on in camera, then you're just gonna set your zebra values to that number. And then you're gonna brighten up the scene until zebras just start to show up on that subject only. This works for skin tones, bright walls, product shots, anything. Oh, and at times throughout this video, I'm gonna show you how zebras work using Sony's M&C app so that you can see the zebras clearly. Controls and interface might look slightly different than the back of your camera, but turning zebras on and setting the levels is exactly the same. First up, do LUTs change zebra values? Zebras, as we learned, are our exposure indicators, and they need to be accurate. So if you're just looking at S-Log on your screen, it's super flat and not very helpful. That's why we use Sony's official conversion LUT that I showed y'all in my original SLOG3 A Simple System to Nail It Every Time video. It lets us preview what the image will look like after color correction with contrast and saturation built in. But here's the catch. That LUT doesn't just change how things look, it also changes when zebras appear. Watch this. We've got the LUT enabled, and we're raising the ISO until zebras just start to show up right here. Cool. Now, we're going to turn that LUT off. Same scene, same settings, and the zebras are gone. So if you trusted that SLOG3 image, you'd end up cranking the ISO even higher to get the zebras to start to appear on that same spot, and you're gonna blow out the highlights in post. So yeah, LUTs affect zebra behavior. Best practices is pretty simple. Always enable your display LUT before checking exposure. With zebras, it gives you a way more accurate preview of what you're really getting. Next was all about how to get exposure when there isn't a skin tone in the shot. So this is pretty straightforward. I know from the chart that if I want my brightest highlight to be at or just below 94, I'm just gonna set my zebra value lower limit to 94. And right now, this shot is way overexposed and my ISO is already as low as it will go for this camera, and that is 800 for the first base ISO in SLOG3. So unless I had an ND filter, all that I can do here to darken the image, in this case, is to bring the f-stop number up until zebras just start to appear on that brightest highlight. So we're kind of working in the opposite direction versus the crash course, but doing the exact same thing ultimately to just have zebras barely on our target of 94 for the brightest highlight in this scene, and that will be our exposure. Let's talk about ISO noise, because nothing ruins a great shot like some digital grain creeping into your shadows. The cleanest ISOs in SLOG3 are usually your camera's base ISOs, and some cameras even have 2 base ISOs. Here's a really quick way to find them. Once you're in SLOG3, look for the ISO value just above the one with the double line markers above and below, and that's your first base ISO. To find your second base ISO, throw the lens cap on your camera lens and bump up the ISO one click at a time and watch closely, because at some point the noise will kind of like click and reset. Like on my ZV-E1, it's going to do that reset at 12,800 ISO. This means that I've got a base ISO in the ZV-E1 of 640 and the second base ISO of 12,800. Not all cameras have 2 base ISOs, but you can easily just Google your model and check. Now, here's the big question. Are those the only ISOs that you should use? No. They're absolutely ideal for clean images, but if I need a different ISO to get the correct exposure, I'm absolutely going to use it. Proper exposure is going to beat sticking to the base ISO every single time. Is this all making sense for you guys? Let me know in the comments down below. How to expose multiple skin tones in the same shot. Alright, you guys are going to be a little bit upset when I show you how easy it is to expose when there are 2 different skin tones in the same shot. Okay, so for this example, we're going to use these 2 skin tones, which if they were by themselves, we'd obviously use a different zebra value. And this is the part y'all are going to be upset about. When they're together, just pick one. And this is I promise you, this is all going to make sense. Okay, let's expose this one to 66. And we're just going to continue to ignore anywhere else in the scene where zebras are going to be showing up and get tunnel visioned here on our priority, which is this skin tone at 66. And simply, boom, that's our exposure. I want you guys to take note of what our ISO and aperture and shutter speed values are here, because I'm not going to change them. Okay, now we have this skin tone, right? The second one. And it's also in the shot and in the same lighting. And it needs to be exposed to 56. So as I mentioned, I'm not going to change anything in camera. All the exposure that we did, ISO, aperture, shutter speed, that's going to stay the exact same. I'm just going to change the zebra value to 56. And look at that. That skin tone is already exposed. So if you expose one, you expose both as long as they're in the same light. All right, quick break from all of that nerdy zebra talk here for a minute. If you really want to master your Sony camera, I put together a course designed to do specifically that. It's so cleverly titled, Master Your Sony Camera in 5 Days. And it's built to give you the speed and confidence with all of your settings, and deep dive into things like exposure, white balance, focus, basic composition, all done in a way that I can't really do on YouTube. Basically, all of those skill sets being wildly important foundations for y'all to master if you want to make your SLOG3 footage look good in the first place. It really is the course that I wish I had when I was first starting out. It would have saved me so much time and headache. But Dave just finished the course, and here's what he said.
Just sensed, because I knew you were a great teacher from your YouTube videos, that there would be some stuff that I didn't realize in there. I must have picked up about half a dozen things that were new to me that I could apply. So, and more important than all the sort of sexy things like phantom LUTs and log and all the rest of it, justified my decision, to invest in the course. So.
It's $199 right now, and I've got a few bonuses available for the next 20 students who enroll. There's going to be a link down below. Y'all can go check that out right now. I'll also put a free link for my exposure guide for SLOG3 for the zebra values that we've been looking at today. Okay, on to the last lesson. Let's wrap this up with one of the trickiest situations, which is what to do when your lighting keeps changing. Maybe you're moving between sunlight and shade, or you're filming indoors where lighting is shifting through the shot. How do you get good SLOG3 exposure without constantly riding the dials and pausing the whole situation to get your exposure right? There's really two situations we have to break down here if you want to get this right. First one is you want the subject to be exposed properly while the light is changing. So another situation where you want the subject, like in a concert, to stay dark in the shadows but exposed properly when the light hits them. For the first situation, what I'm going to do is kick my camera into S for shutter priority. Next, I'm going to drop the ISO into auto by scrolling right past the lowest ISO value. And you can also go into the menu under your ISO settings and change the range that the ISO is going to be limited to. Next, when I'm in the brightest part of the scene and facing the light source, not in the shadows for this example, facing the light source, the brightest part of the scene, I'll turn the zebras on with the levels at, for my skin tone, about 66. And then I'm going to change the compensation dial on the camera until the zebras are just barely showing up like before, and I'm done. And now, as I move into the shadows and back into the light, the camera will do all of the work while changing the ISO and the aperture to dial in the exposure that I just set in the brightest part of the scene. Now, if you want to use this method, but you try to keep some blur in the background, because when the aperture numbers are getting higher, that blur is going to be gone. If you just put an ND filter on your lens, that'll keep the aperture numbers pretty low in those bright spots. But in the dark spots, it's also going to make your ISOs a lot higher. So there's always kind of a trade-off when we're doing this exposure thing. Now, for situation two, like a concert, where you want your subject to be darker when they're not in some kind of spotlight or ultra bright light, here's the move. Wait until they're in the brightest light. And then you're just going to use your zebras to expose their skin tone in that brightest light. Set your exposure there and leave it. When the lights go down or they move into the shadows, they'll look like they're actually in the shadows, which is what we want. And it might take some pre-planning. It's if it's a controlled commercial shoot, that's pretty easy to do in the pre-planning before the concert's going live in that example. But even in a run and gun situation, just wait for that key lighting moment to dial things in. It's tricky at first and you might have to wait for a few highlights to hit a subject, but with some practice, it's going to become second nature. And if you really want to get even more detail about SLOG3, you're going to want to check out this video where I dive into all the details and give you the cheat code for how to nail it every single time and talk a lot more than just exposure when it comes to SLOG3. See you in the next video. Take care. See ya.